Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our second evening online travel talk during the Leicester lockdown. We're pleased this evening to have a talk about the history of Leicester's trams. And John Lascelles, my husband, who's here beside me, is going to do this talk. He's loved trams since he was a little boy growing up in London, and he's very knowledgeable now about everything to do with trams. So welcome to those of you who are watching on YouTube. Do like and subscribe to our channel. And if you haven't already, do look at some of the other talks as well. Anyway, over to you, John.
Okay, thank you. Let's sit back and we'll start on our journey. Right, first of all, let me explain why am I giving a talk on Leicester's trams. I never grew up in Leicester. I never travelled on a tram in Leicester. I've travelled on trams in London and other places, and I indeed have travelled on a Leicester tram at Christchurch. When I came to Leicester, I became good friends with Peter Mullahy, who some of you may remember. He grew up in Leicester. He had a wonderful collection of postcards and tickets and slides, and he used to give talks about Leicester's tramways. Sadly, Peter developed throat cancer. He was unable to do his talk in latter years. So I would go with him. I would do the talk using his notes, and he would show the slides and put me right if I went wrong. So I've inherited this talk from Peter Mullahy. So it's in his area on perhaps the last time he went on a tram, which was in Blackpool, annual trip to Blackpool. So a good friend of mine. So Peter, this is in your memory for giving me an enthusiasm for a city that I've adopted as my home after London. So without any more, let's go on to the next slide. Right, are you sitting comfortably? Right. Yeah. Then hold very tight, please. Right, we'll start not with electric trams, but with the horse tram era. Horse trams. When you think of tramways, you obviously think of passenger carrying vehicles running on rails laid in the road. But in fact, tramways go back further than that. The original tramways were in mines and quarries when they needed to move around tubs full of coal and slate and iron ore. And they soon discovered that it was easier to move a wagon if it ran on rails that provided a smooth surface and a guidance system. And indeed, some of these early rails were actually made out of wood. The principle was there. Something is easier to move if it's got a smooth surface and it requires less energy. The whole idea of trams for carrying passengers on the street began in America, as early as 1832. The Americans, of course, called them street railways, which is a pretty good description of what they are. So this American idea of the street railway actually came to the British shores in 1860 in Birkenhead. And by the time the trams came to Leicester, it was quite a craze. There was even a Tramways Act of 1870 to try and regulate the construction and operation of this newfangled means of transport. So it was in 1874 that the Mr. Buster Busby of Liverpool and the Mr. Turton of Leeds formed the Leicester Tramway Company. And the first tram service ran from the Clock Tower to Belgrave. It opened of all days on Christmas Eve in 1874. The tram you see is a single horse car built by Starbucks of Birkenhead. We have a very similar tram in Christchurch. I'll show you in a minute. This was obviously taken in the summer of 1875. You can see the trees are in full bloom here. The crews worked 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. Here is our Sheffield number 15, running at Christchurch, very similar to the trams that began service in Leicester. Carrying passengers on, this is a knife-board horse tram. The passengers clambered up the stairs at each end and sat back to back on a long seat along the roof. You appreciate trams are double-ended. The conductor and driver just changed ends, and you unhitch the horse and couple that to the other end as well. Notice there's no screens around the seats. Mainly workmen travelled on the top deck. This picture is interesting, taken outside Welford Road Prison. And if you look on the left-hand side, you see a young lady sitting up there. How dare she invade this male preserve? And you can see there are now sides along by the railings, known as decency boards for obvious reasons, in case you caught sight of a young lady's ankles or legs. So decency boards had to be put up. This is a nice picture outside the prison. Steam, it wasn't long, 1876, before they thought they'd try something else. They're very limited with horses, you know, the speed and the size of the vehicle, there's not much you can do. So they tried a steam tram, built at the Falcon Works, which is now Brush, and it was tried for a few days, I think, but it was not a success. It ran on the route up to Belgrave and the London Road. I think basically it was just too heavy for the lightly constructed horse car rails. And here you can see the men sitting on the top deck. This was actually taken in Glasgow, Government Photographic Studio. And I don't think it was much of a success in Glasgow either, because they didn't have steam trams, although many northern towns did opt for this form of traction. It looks like a garden shed on wheels, but inside there is like a small locomotive. But I think that was possibly the first time a steam tram was ever tried on British soil. It was a success, so they went back to the horses. Let's have a look at some horse car routes. One of the lines was called the Churchgate Flyer, probably, or the Churchgate Express. It ran up Churchgate to St Margaret's Church and onto Sandford. And this always was work with single deck cars. It's a nice coloured photograph there. And here's one going round the clock tower. Interesting that electric trams never ran up Churchgate. Later, the horse trams had conventional garden seats in a transverse direction, which mean they could carry even more people. The crew look a bit down at heel, don't they? But this is typical horse tram run by the Leicester Tramways Company. A nice scene outside London Road Station. You've noticed that the station isn't finished, so it must be about 1891, 1892. Also notice the church, which isn't there. This church was dismantled stone by stone and is now St Stephen's Church, the URC Church. It's rebuilt on New Walk and De Montfort Street. Obviously, it got in the way of the railway project at the station. So that is the church that moved, quite a famous Leicester feature. This shows an interesting feature. Part of the Tramways Act of 1870 so that the tramway operators had to maintain the roadway in between the tracks and 18 inches on either side. So you'll notice the road paving is quite different where the trams are running. You also notice that the trams are carrying advertisements and the actual destination sometimes gets lost amongst the advertising. What's new? Advertising is quite prominent today, isn't it? And that's again another picture of a tram passing that church that moved. And people on the top deck with umbrellas up. I don't know whether it's raining or whether it's for the sunshade. And shortly past this point, they would have attached a third horse to help pull the tram up London Road towards Victoria Park, called a trace horse. Just by contrast, here's Leicester Tramways Company's bus. Now that would have given you quite a rough ride on the road surfaces of the day, would actually have carried fewer people. So you've got a much smoother, more comfortable ride on the tram than on a horse bus. Picture in Humberston Gate. This is in about the 1880s, about the turn of the century. All the buildings are now gone. This is an area which is now pedestrianised. It used to be the site of having various street fairs. Electrification. This is the tramway system at its maximum extent for the horse trams. So the Leicester Council decided they'd exercise their rights under the Tramways Act to compulsorily purchase the Tramways Company, and they were going to set about having electric trams, bringing their city into the 20th century. So quite a bit of progress. At its maximum extent then, there was about 9 miles of track. The corporation bought the tramway undertaking for £134,110. They got 39 trams, 30 horse buses, 375 horses, 9 miles of track, and various buildings. And once they set apart, completely rebuilding and extending the tramway system. The horsepower rails were no good for the heavier electric cars. So it's a massive project that took over 3 years and turned Leicester into a major construction site. Here we see interesting here, the Melton turn where the Blackbird Road goes off to the left. Some of the shops apparently were told not to put out their shop blinds because there were temporary tracks for the horse cars laid near the pavement. One of them apparently lost his shop blind. So for 3 years, Leicester was a major construction site. Let's have a look at some of the other work that went on. One of the major projects, of course, was around the clock tower. Over 100 tons of rail. This special work was manufactured by Hadfields of Sheffield, and they laid the track out in their yard. This is the track for the clock tower, to make sure that it was accurate and all the measurements were there and there'd be no problems when they came to Leicester. This site now is where there's the big shopping centre of Meadow Hall, but this was a regular feature, the test special work, and they dismantle it and bring it to Leicester and install it, and it all fitted. There were no hiccups. This was known as the Siege of Leicester, and apparently for 10 days, track was put down and all the paving was put back in 10 days. Can you imagine today? It would take 10 months at least, wouldn't it? But bear in mind that the clock tower was the centre of the city and all the roads passed through the clock tower. So no wonder it was called the Siege. And here's some of the workmen. You can tell the gaffer, he has the bowler hat on. Your headgear was a badge of office. So this is all done with in-house labour, but 10 days was quite an achievement to get the track down and all the paving in. Also, the car depots had to be built on Abbey Park Road. And of course, the power station at Painter Street, known as Lero, I think, yes, later became Leicester College. But the power station, coal, of course, fossil fuel was all you had in those days. You didn't know about any other source. So here's the boilers being put in. Someone we kept busy here, keeping them stoked up. Here's one of the generators provided by Dick Kerr. And look at the interior of the power station. Look at the ornate brickwork. Although these were civic buildings of an industrial nature, they were of a style. They wanted the best for their city. There was a civic pride. You see similar things if you go to Abbey pumping station, of how even an industrial building had a style to it. And of course, there's a lot of excavation to bring the miles of cabling from the power station out to the tramway system. And if you've been to Nottingham when they built their new tram system, you can see exactly the same thing going on, getting the power out to the tramways. Low Bridge, Nelson Road. Notice how the tracks have to interlace here so that the trams pass each other. They can't pass under the bridge, of course, right in the centre. And apparently people were told to keep their seats going under the bridge and not touch the wire. So much for health and safety. Overhead wires. Look at the ornate bracket arms and the scroll work. Street furniture had a style to it. If you look at the diagram on the right, you can see it also incorporated incandescent street lighting. So that's another major improvement, trams, electricity, and street lighting. So a style to the overhead. What about the trams themselves? Mr. Manfield, the consulting engineer, specified what he wanted from the trams, how he wanted them to be built. And 2 prototypes were supplied, one by Brush and one by the Dick Kerr Company of Preston. So they differ slightly from the production batch, but you can see the style of them. They have reverse stairs, which you ascend in a clockwise direction. You end up over the top of the driver's head. The driver has very little, if any, visibility out to the left at all. You can see the wooden reversible seats on the top deck of the trolley pole that collects the power from the overhead wires. But apparently there was a dispute over this because Dick Kerr they specified, they didn't stick to the specifications. They added a few extra bits which they thought the corporation would like, and they did like them. But Brush stuck exactly to the specification that they were asked. So the council said to Brush, okay, if you can make a few alterations to your design so that they're the same as the Dick Kerr car, we'll give you half of the order. Well, they weren't prepared to alter that. The Brush cars cost £497, 18 shillings. Dick Kerr's £510. They weren't prepared to make significant alterations to the tram and keep their price the same. But the whole order went to Dick Kerr. So there's quite a furore over that because Brush, of course, was a local firm and they didn't get the order. Inside, the cars were beautifully made, wonderful bits of craftsmanship. But the woodwork, the wooden seats, but beautifully made. The cut glass lampshades, the controllers that controlled the tram, controlled the speed. These are provided as well. But the tram actually sat on a truck of this type, 6-foot wheelbase. There's a tremendous overhang at each end, which says something about the rather unsteady ride you got. 6-foot wheelbase. Trams are at least 3 or 4 times longer than that. So one of the trucks. This is taken at Christchurch. It shows the tram controls. Basically, on your right-hand side, you have a handbrake, which pulls on levers and rods under the platform and pulls the brake blocks onto the wheels. The controller on the left, you move it in a clockwise direction. It cuts out notches and connects the motors in series and then in parallel. But in fact, in what you would do, you get the tram going and put your controller off and coast along to save electricity. Economy was important. They used to say, punctuality, safety, punctuality, and economy. So if you could get it going and coast along with no power, that saved energy. On the floor, you have a pedal to sound the gong, a pedal to put sand on the rails if the diesel is poor, another one to set the lifeguard in case someone falls under the tram. So come to Christchurch and you'll see similar things. The trams, of course, had to be tested. And I think the first test took place in the middle of the night. This sort of thing even happens today in places like Manchester and Nottingham. But normally the enthusiasts find out and some people turn up to see it. But the first tests were at night in case anything went wrong. So on April the 21st, they did a test in the day, ran out to Belgrave, and guess what? There was a power failure. And the tram was stuck there for a few hours. People had to go back by horse car. But those things happen. Notice the children that come out from the school. Perhaps it's difficult to appreciate what it must have been like when you were only used to seeing horses pulling vehicles. It was a wonder of the age. What made it move? How did it go along? Just imagine what a wonderful thing this was. But Leicester was moving into the modern age when they'd only ever known horse transport. There's a scene inside the depot at Abbey Road. You can see the inspection pits and the new cars that are being delivered from Dick Kerr. A nice line-up of some of the people that keep the show on the road. Again, you can spot the boss at the back in his bowler hat. They would be engineers, electricians, painters, cleaners, a whole army of men to keep trams working. I wonder how many of those are perhaps transferred from the horse tramway. Some of the people responsible, Mr. Manville was the consulting engineer. If there are any problems, he would sort it out. The actual committee went on a tour around Britain and around Europe at enormous expense studying tramways, which added to some confusion as to what Leicester needed. So Mr. Manville decided that they would need overhead power wires and not some other more complicated surface contact or conduit system. Osmond Sorday was the mayor of Leicester at the time. Mr. Lucas came from the previous horse tramway company. He was the secretary and manager. And Mr. George Morby, the borough electrical tramways engineer. He was the real brains behind the outfit, responsible for all the construction. And it was a great achievement that this all happened within 3 years. Opening day was a great day that happened at last. Here we are on the 18th of May, 1904, and the trams are all lined up here. There was quite an occasion. All the civic dignitaries went out to the tram depot in horse cars. They visited the power station, and the wives of some of the civic dignitaries pulled the lever to put the power on. So it was a great occasion that set off through the town. 18th of May, opening day, Painter Street Power Station. So the Civic Party boarded the cars, and then they went through to Stoneygate. And look at this going past the clock tower. Look at the crowds of people that have turned out to see the wonder of a tram that moves without horses pulling it. It's been interesting towards the end of the talk, those who turned out to see the last tram 45 years later. The first tram went down to Stoneygate, came back to the station, and then there was a great banquet, I think, at the museum in New Walk, and the trams ran carrying the public for the rest of the day. Here's some of the people who were on the Tramways committee, and there are some prominent names there that we will see. Alderman Surday at the top of the mayor. Well, postcards like this were produced in lots of cities, saying goodbye to your horse trams. This one's for Leicester, but these sort of things appeared all over the country. 18th of May, 1904. But it wasn't actually quite the end of the horse trams, because other routes were being electrified, and horse trams continued to run for about another 5.5 months on some routes while the electrification work was being completed. So here's one of the last horse cars running along Granby Street. You can see the destination clock tower is getting lost amongst the adverts for Cars Fevers powders. Also notice somebody getting off the tram while it's moving. Generally with a horse tram, you tried to keep it moving, you slowed down, because starting a tram from rest was a great strain on the horses. So if you could get on and off while it was moving, they would only stop perhaps for elderly passengers or for women, but keep the tram moving and it's much less strain on the horses. And the drivers actually got an added bonus, I think, if their horses were well cared for. Now, this is interesting. Towards the end of the horse tram era, here's another horse tram. It says Clarendon Park on there, which was never a horse tram route, and you can see the conductor standing up on the top deck, the horses on the other end, horse tram running on an electric route before it's ready to go into service. But it's hard to imagine horse transport today. When you think to keep a horse tram on the road, you'd need about 5 teams of horses, about 10 horses, 5 teams of 2 to get through a working day. The men weren't so fortunate, they worked right the way through. So for every tram on the road, you need 10 horses. Multiply that with all the other wagons and horse buses, and think of the amount of horse droppings and manure and urine deposited upon the road, the mud and the slush in winter, the dirt and the dust in summer. We think pollution is something new. So electric traction was going to end the pollution. Still a solution today. Let's have a look at one of the new trams in service. This is taken at Ayleston. Of interest here are the reverse stairs, up over the driver's head. You can see the conductor with his bell punch. You see the seats on the top deck, and you see the lifeguard on the front. If you fell in front of a tram, the lifeguard would hit you, and a wooden tray would drop down onto the rails and scoop you up. You've got broken bones, I suppose, or a few bruises, but you wouldn't be run over. And at one of my talks, somebody said, "Oh, my sister fell in front of a tram with a little girl, and she was picked up by the lifeguard, and it saved her being run over." So it did actually work. This is at Crich, London County Council tram number 106. It's very, very similar to those that began service in Leicester, even a similar livery. All that's different is that the staircases were later reversed round, so that which was more convenient. So if you come to Crich and that's running, that was almost identical to what we had in Leicester. A few scenes of electric trams in service in Granby Street. How many buildings are still there today? The Grand Hotel, I think, is still there. But apart from the trams, it's just wagons and horse-drawn carts and hand carts, no other motor vehicles. Nice scene outside London Road Station. The church has gone, you'll notice. That's being rebuilt on New Walk and De Montfort Street. You can notice the ornate standards with the lamps on them. Nice scene on the London Road. Again, not much traffic, just horse carts, lots of pedestrians. And Hinckley Road, I wonder whether the girls on the left are off in their Sunday best going to church. Actually, some of the scenes on the Hinckley Road, you can actually recognise it today, I think. Covered top tram. The first covered top tram came in 1905, a purpose-built covered top tram. Notice the children on the top deck. It's a favourite place for schoolboys to sit up there. They could get up to all kinds of tricks, pull the trolley off the wire, change the destination lines, all kinds of things. Notice also that all the windows on the top deck are wound down. There was a wheel and the conductor could wind the windows down. They'd all come down at the same time. Sometimes on a hot day, an inspector would hold up several fingers to indicate how many inches the conductor was to lower the windows by. Also notice the stairs, there's some holes in the stairs, a little flat, so that the driver's got some visibility, not much, out to the left, better than nothing. And that flap had to be closed at the conductor's end in case he looked at young ladies' ankles going up the stairs. Very prudish people, the Victorians and Edwardians. So there's the first purpose-built double-deck car. But notice the flap holes in the stairs. You can see that if you come to Christ and see Leicester 76. Sadly, accidents will happen. Classic tramway accident when you try and overtake a tram and you meet one coming the other way. And this happened on, I think it was on the East Park Road route where the baker's van got sandwiched between two trams. Sadly, the horse had to be destroyed and the driver of the baker's van later died in hospital. So a tragic accident which used to happen in London as well. People used to get sandwiched between the trams because there was only about a foot or two clearance. And it also shows a covered top car and on the open toppers. How are we doing time-wise? Water car. Yes, there needed some works cars. And here's an example that will water the tracks. And the chap on the back was someone called Herbert Riley. And he saw this photograph when he was an 80-year-old gentleman. He said, "That's me. I recognise that." And he told the story of working for the corporation and doing some repairs on one of the controllers, and he forgot to put the power off. But a terrific electric shock was hurled across the depot, and he brought out the circuit breakers, the fuses, and brought the whole tram system to a halt. Well, there's a water car for you. Another kind of car they had a tower on the roof so people could work on the overhead wire. This drawing was done by Mark Pearson, showing it in use. So right. Hold tight, please.
Yeah, got to get on board.
Oh, welcome back. As well as the tram works vehicles, they also had two Leyland tower wagons built in 1911 with solid tyres. These were apparently used right up until the 1950s. Their last duty were removing the overhead tram wires when the system closed down. One of them survived remarkably at Abbey Park Road depot. Apparently, it was quite handy for getting up into the roof and changing the light bulbs. I don't know whether that's true or not, but anyway, it survived long enough to be restored, and you can now see it sometimes if you go to the Abbey pumping station. So a motorised tower wagon built by Leyland. An experiment with pay as you enter, not paying the driver, but paying the conductor. The conductor would stay on the platform and people would pay when they got on. This was an experiment of 1913, and they had 20 extra trams, 10 by Dick Kerr, and Brush got to build 10 of them this time, so obviously they filled the rift. They were friends again. It ran on the Narborough Road route for about 18 months, but it wasn't a very successful idea. It had longer platforms, longer wheelbase, and people would get on at the back and passengers from the top deck would get off at the front. And they would pay the conductor as they got on rather than him walking around collecting the fares. Well, World War I, Abbey Park Road depot, noticed the tram has got a mast over the headlamp and there are some recruiting posters in the window. Another one that also shows, this has obviously had a bit of a prang, hasn't it? And now you can see there the posters recruiting for the First World War. You can also see at the top there a little wheel, which the conductor would use to lower the windows. So this is obviously with the war damage, but it's nice to show the posters. Well, of course, so many men went to fight in the First World War. There was a shortage of staff, and women were recruited as conductresses. They never drove the trams in Leicester, either in the First or Second World War, as they did in other cities. And here's a line-up. The faces don't come out very well, with their new uniforms, taking over the role of the men. The latest shot there, and it shows the conductress in her uniform, standing alongside one of the cars, and the driver, of course, standing under the stairs. Baked beans are still with us, I see. Some things don't change. Well, at the end of the First World War, I'm glossing over the tremendous suffering, of course, and the fact that they had to keep the system going and make do and mend, and things were getting in quite a difficult state. But women kept the trams going. And here at the end of the war, one of the conductors is saying goodbye, because the men that come back, or any other men, actually want their jobs back. After the First World War, they began to think of motor buses. In fact, they were going to run motor buses before the First World War, but apparently the motor vehicles they bought were requisitioned for the armed forces. So it wasn't until 1924 that they started to run motor buses as well as trams. This is the Tilling-Stevens petrol electric. And someone who came back who used to drive tanks at Combray said the tanks at Combray were easier to drive than these things, but I take his word for that. And later, some of these were made into double-deckers. You can see the outside staircase and the solid tyres. And it's now called the City of Leicester Tramways and Motor Omnibus Department. So buses begin to have an increasing role. It wasn't the end for the trams. There were extensions built. An extension was built along the Welford Road to join up with Clarendon Park Road. And coming down the hill by the Welford Road Cemetery is quite a steep hill there. Kirby and West, so they're still around, I'm not sure. And trams working on that route had additional braking. If you look between the wheels, you see a track brake, track that can be wound down onto the track. And that was specifically there for trams that were working down that steep hill by Welford Road Cemetery. Also notice the windows on the top decks are wound down. Must have been quite a hot day, mustn't it? The other new route that was opened, of course, was along Blackbird Road, where it actually had its own track, and it would join up at the Woodgate. This was quite useful in the Second World War because some of the trams would be kept there overnight in case there was a direct hit on the depot. So, yes, there were some tram extensions after the First World War. It wasn't the end for trams. Another route they built was to turning off the Uppingham Road and going down Coleman Road. I think the original intention was to go all the way to the General Hospital, but they never got that far. And here we are. It got as far as East Park Road, I think. Never got to the hospital. Notice the trolley pole being turned around on the triangular trolley reverser, so the conductor didn't have to get out and walk around with it. It's a big. Tramways now were more or less at their maximum extent, about 22.74 miles after those extensions were opened. At their maximum, there was 178 trams and 3 works cars, and of course the 2 motorised tower wagons. So here's your maximum extent of the tramway system. Tramways, you see, are entirely within the city boundary and never reached logical objectives like Wigston, Abbey, Birstall. They were confined very much within our lockdown area, if you like. 1923, an attempt to build a really enclosed car. They changed the stairs round so that passengers could board 2 at a time. You know, on the right to go up the stairs, on the left to go to the lower saloon. And this was nicknamed the Noah's Ark because the passengers could board 2 by 2, much quicker at loading. It had more comfortable seats, more powerful motors. It really made a good job of it, but it was too expensive. It was cheap, just to cover in what you've got, wooden seats and all. So a great programme was set about covering in the existing trams, keeping the reverse stairs, even though they were quite hazardous. And workshops, Abbey Park Road, wonderful woodworkers, craftsmen, joiners. Tram bodies are mainly of wood. Some of the trams had extended platforms. You can see the lower deck is slightly longer than the top deck. It creates a bit more room for passengers when they're loading. So basically, there are all kinds of permutations. They just covered in what they've got. Mark Pearson, who was the expert on Leicester's trams, he drew some nice pictures showing that one stage of the 1920s, there were trams in all kinds of different stages, some with top decks, some with partly covered in upper balconies, some had got driver's windscreens, some hadn't. There was a great mix of trams, but the programme was to get them all fully enclosed, but not to build anything special. Great shame. Some scenes in the 1920s, trams actually pulled into the curb in High Street by Eastgate. Look at the queuing pens here. Notice that everybody has a hat on, and I'm not sure about the typhoon tea for indigestion. And people queuing for the Narborough Road cars, Foss Road via Great Central Street, Foss Road cars by King Richard Road. And here indeed is Great Central Station. In my mind, one of the great crimes of vandalism was closing the Great Central line. It would have given us another route going north, and maybe we wouldn't have needed HS2, I don't know. But here's the scene in Great Central Street. The buildings are still, they're very much a backwater today. Here, as it was in its heyday, people arriving by motor car. So they were decorating trams for advertising was always been quite useful. In the 1920s, the Mayor's Distress Fund, and this would have coloured lights on it, and they collected money, I think, for beds for the Children's Hospital and the Distress Fund for people who were unemployed. And nothing changes, does it really? I like this scene. Maybe this is a lunch hour, or people going home from work on their bicycles. There's a policeman on clock tower duty. But I think this is where the bank is now. I'm not quite sure, but this is where HSBC is. But look at all those bicycles about to set off and in danger of their lives, cycling across all those tram rails at the clock tower. I wonder how many came to grief. But the first route to come off was the Melbourne Road service, which was a narrow street with single track and lots of passing places. The track was worn out, the service was slow. So the Melbourne Road was the first one to close in, I think, 1933. That's an earlier picture going along Needham Street. You can still travel along these streets today. I often drive along it because I like to drive along the old Melbourne Road tram route. One of the first to close. Trolley buses. Well, Leicester never had trolley buses. A lot of discussions took place in the city council. What was to be the future of the trams? Whether to spend money on the track, on new cars, whether to go with the diesel buses. The electricity department was keen that she'd have trolley buses because the tramways were the biggest user of municipally produced electricity. And trolley buses, of course, could have used all the electrical installation that was there. We just needed additional 2 wires for the trolley booms, but they never did have trolley buses. The electricity department were very keen that they should. In fact, they opted for diesel buses. Maybe the thought of the complexity of wiring around the clock tower, or it could have been that the transport department always thought they were being overcharged for their electricity because the electric department was now something quite separate from the trams. So we'll have diesel buses, then we won't owe them anything. I don't know. But trolley buses were not to run in Leicester, although they were quite active in places like Nottingham and Derby. A few scenes here. A sharp bend here from Foss Road North, turning into King Richard Road. This was one of the routes that was going to be closed before the war in 1939. The trams ceased to go along King Richard Road and just used to stop on Foss Road. Football siding on Saffron Lane. Imagine all these trams bringing people to watch a football match from the station and then staying there for the duration of the match to take people back again. But that was I wonder whether the crews got a free ticket or whether, I don't know, we just had a cup of tea and read the paper, but they were waiting for the end of the match. I said trams can be decorated. This was the Leicester pageant in 1932 or 1933. And apparently there were no changing facilities at Abbey Park. It was a great pageant. So people would travel to the pageant dressed in their costume. So you might get on a tram and be sitting next to Cardinal Wolsey or a Roman centurion. So here we are advertising at the pageant. Trams have always been very good mobile advertising holdings. Some scenes in Abbey Park Road, where the trams were beautifully maintained, even though they were, you know, quite old-fashioned, but they were well maintained. And again, woodworkers, craftsmen, maybe repairing some accident damage. And they were kept immaculately clean. I also think it's important. I think we've learnt the value of cleaners, haven't we, in the last few weeks? People who clean our hospitals, our schools, our streets, our public transport, you know, essential for our healthy and safe and pleasant environment. Bachelor bowls, they're still there, I think, aren't they? Some things are still the test of time. In the late 1930s, the livery was changed. In tram number 19 is mainly in a maroon livery with some cream, and the tram in front looks rather more 1930s. It made the trams look a bit more modern and probably easier to paint. So a change of livery just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Seen in Abbey Park Road Depot. I think one of the trams, probably the second one in from the left, is Leicester 76, which survives the crash, of course. Oh, on to World War II. And there's a tram. They've blanked out the word Leicester in case any German parachuters don't know where they are. I'm sure it wouldn't have taken them long. They could have walked into Leicester.
It's working now.
And the headlamp is blanked out. The one here with the white paint around the fenders for the blackout, telling you to save fuel here on coal, coke, gas, electricity, fuel oil, paraffin, save fuel for the factories. And of course, with the Second World War, all the plans of replacing the tramways by buses had to be put on hold. If you had a tramway system, you had to keep it, because trams, of course, use electricity, produced from home-produced coal. You know, fuel oil was in scarce supplies. Every city with trams had to keep them going, as it happened for another 10 years. Otherwise, many of them would have disappeared in the early 40s. Okay, back come the women conductors. Inspector Ted Stanion, rather more modern uniforms perhaps, instructing new conductresses and showing them how to change the points. Leicester got off comparatively lightly with war damage. I think about 146 people were killed in air raids, 91 of those during the 19th and 20th of November in 1940. And some damage was caused on the London Road by a landmine. The tracks were relayed. Apparently there was always a lurch when the tram went over the repairs. Trams advertising keep fit. You want the population fit during the war. And this was basically pre-war advertising the Minister for Health at the Montfort Hall, keeping people fit, having exercises. We even know that's important today, don't we, with the pandemic, going out and getting some exercise. Raising money for a battleship. This tram has got a canvas for the battleship Renown, and the Leicester population raised money. This was a complete canvas painted by someone called Charles Herbert. Not sure how the driver could see his way out. He's sitting at the front, or how this got round the corner with the pointed bow of the ship on it. Well, this would tour at Leicester, raising money for a battleship. Look, recycling, nothing new, saving metal, rags, bones, paper. Anything salvageable had to be saved and used during the war, putting out pig bins, everything. So this would tour Leicester. Notice the loudspeaker at the front. I don't think they carry passengers when they're doing this. I'm sure they didn't. Save bones, save paper, save metal. Recycling is nothing new and necessity. And even after the war, save money, be wise and save. So trams, this is a silver lining week. So after 1945, the Undertaker were now quite quick to carry on with replacing their trams by buses. But it would be 2 or 3 more years before there were enough buses available. So trams still had to be kept going into those early post-war years. There's a nice scene here turning into Gallotree Gate on a wet day. Lots of shoppers out there. A few post-war scenes here. On the Melbourne Road, you can see the turn off going up the Leicester Road. Allen's buses, that was a private bus operator. As the tramways were beginning to be replaced route by route, so tram enthusiasts would come to Leicester and hire a special tram for a tour. This is number 36. Remember this number. I think it was the Southern Counties Touring Association ventured as far north as Leicester to tour the remaining tram routes, knowing that line by line, trams are going to be replaced by buses. Full of enthusiasts there. A nice view looking up London Road, up towards the Victoria Park. You know, of course, we've got the bike lanes in there. Still lots of trams, but one bus in evidence. This is near, coming across the top. You recognise that building opposite Victoria Park. Wonderful building, still there today. But gradually, the trams were coming off route by route by route. Well, this actually looks quite modern, doesn't it? 155 in the new livery. But bear in mind that the technology was still that of 1904. Unlike other cities that had more modern trams in the 1930s, Leicester still had wooden seats. They still relied on the driver having to stop the tram with a handbrake. There were no air brakes, nothing modern. It was still the technology of 1904. This does really look rather sad, doesn't it? This is on the Welford Road, where the lines used to branch off and go along Clarendon Park Road and the Queen's Road. This is where Peter Mullahy used to come with his dad, I think, and like to watch the trams on a Sunday morning and the conductor turning the trolley pole round. Trams were now, once for the pride of the city, were now an embarrassment. Gradually, line by line, they were being replaced, starting really in about 1947. Lines to Ayleston Road went, then Narborough Road, Western Park, Ruby Road, Clarendon Park Road, then Blackbird Road. Every few months, tram routes will be replaced. Nice scene in the city centre. Maybe you remember these wartime lorries. This is nice. Turning from Bowling Green Street into Beaver Street, right near the College of Education. And Joseph Johnson, that became Phoenix. It's now sort of empty. This street today is rather sad, full of empty, derelict shops, but then it was a bustling street. Look at the number of cars. Trams are being blamed for traffic congestion, for hold-ups, getting in the way of those who are well enough off to buy cars. Trams were blamed for traffic jams. They were seen to be old-fashioned. They decided against trolley buses, and motor buses are what the cities needed. This is near Mayfield Road on the left. The tracks going off down Victoria Park on the right. The tram will have come from Stoneygate or from Clarendon Park. Eventually, we get down the end of 1949 to one route only, running from the depot, the central depot, out to Humberston, with a line running up to the main depot at Abbey Park, which was not used for service trams, just for trams going for maintenance. We've now got down the one route. It's the end of 1949. This route ran out to Humberston. There's a line going off here. I'm not quite sure if it's a line going off to East Park Road or one of the routes turning off. There were two railway bridges across the Uppingham Road at that time. And here we are at the terminus at Humberston, where the park is still there. And in the background is the Trocadero Cinema. And apparently there were grooves in the tarmac where a tram once ran off the end of the track. Route number 12 is Special Car, another one of the trams being used for a tour for enthusiasts touring the remaining route. Central Depot, well, this was built for horse cars originally. Towards the end, the trams ran out from Central Depot. Where is Central Depot? If you've ever been in the Haymarket Shopping Centre, that's where the Central Tram Depot was. And towards the end, the trams ran out from Central Depot and only went to Abbey Park Road for repairs and maintenance. Look at the Transport Office on the left. It was a tight fit, known as the hole in the wall. And there's a tram there just pulling out, and there's one of the new buses taking over. It's on the Highway Road route. The trams just came out from the depot. Towards the last day, it was wet, And the trams changed over in the middle of the day, not at the end of the day, as so often happened. So as crews finished their duty, the next few crews would come on with buses. And for a while, there were both trams and buses running out from Humberston Gate out to the park at Humberston. That's what it used to look like in the 1930s. Trams very much in evidence. Go back now, and buses very much dominate the scene. Just a handful of trams needed for the last route. That's how it used to be. And there's the shelter. And the bus is ready to take over. So during the day, trams came off, motor buses came on. The last tram was decorated especially, number 58. We mourn the loss of faithful friends from the streets of our grand old city. The move of the times, we cannot have limes, so go they must. It's a pity. And there's some impressive statistics of the miles that the trams have run. Of interest on the other side, somebody brought a little rhyme based on the radio, or should I say wireless programs of today. It says, after much binding, those you have loved are bandwagons. Buses take it from here. If you're old enough, like me, you'll remember those programs. And this did a trip out to Humberston with as many members of the public who could get on board. And it came back to the depot where civic dignitaries and invited guests were on board for the last journey of all. Crowds of people turned out to see the last tram. Remember listening to the crowds that turned out all those years ago when the electric tram was the wonder of the age, something every city wanted. Now, with the move at the times, we cannot have lines. And here's the last tram pulling into Abbey Park Road depot, and the last crew members here. I think the driver was Mr. Bennett. No, the driver was Mr. Timpson, one of the senior drivers, who I think began his work in 1905, and conductor was Mr. Bennett. And both of those were senior drivers and conductors who spent most of their working lives on the trams. It's a nice close-up of them. Notice he's using one of the new ultimate ticket machines, which used to issue those little square, pre-printed tickets. I think one of them retired. One had a few more years to do on the buses. What happened to the rest of the trams? Well, they were broken up, they were scrapped, including number 36. This was being kept for Leicester museums, but apparently, so Peter Mullahy told me, the museum committee just could not make up their mind whether they wanted it or not. And then one day in 1950, the manager took it out there and it was scrapped. The day after, they decided they wanted it. Typical. What happened to the trams? Well, many of them went to the dealer. A lot of them were sold because they made good farm buildings, holiday cottages, garden sheds. And you could buy one from £5 to £10, minus all the electrical bits. The wheels, the trucks, the motors, many of those got sold on for further service to Calcutta. But the tram bodies could be bought for a bargain. And you've got I think 5 of these actually went to a farm out in Markfield. I think that might be number 31. There's quite a story behind that. And if you want to know a bit more, you could log on to Leicester Tram 31 website, because that's a possible preservation job for the future. But it was not the end. Members of the newly formed Tramway Museum Society found the Leicester tram on a farm at Snaith in Yorkshire, and the body was in very good condition. It was all there, and they acquired it for the Tramway Museum at Christchurch. It was restored under the most difficult conditions. There was no workshop at Christchurch in those days, and they did an amazing job. You can see someone working on a power drill here in restoring Leicester 76, gradually coming together. Some of the parts actually came off of Leicester tram number 31 from that farm at Markfield. And eventually, it's a remarkable achievement. We have a Leicester tram again, number 76, and its open platform, open balcony condition. Here it is in service in the 1970s. I did travel on it at Christ. I must admit at that time I didn't live in Leicester. Otherwise I might have paid a bit more attention to it. But the day of a ride on it, I had no idea that I would one day be a Leicester citizen. So, Leicester 76. And it was used for some publicity shots to promote the museum and some suitable horse-drawn vehicles and people in period costumes going to Ruby Road. On a wonderful occasion when it met up with the Tower Wagon and the restored Leicester bus, the AC Renown. I wonder how many years previously these vehicles had ever met together. And this, another one, you often see this bus at rallies in Leicester, beautifully restored. So there's a lot of Leicester transport heritage. It's not just the trams, but buses as well. So here we have a Leicester tram has survived, and maybe number 31, sometime in the future, might be restored as a Leicester tram, but in perhaps a different period of history. Leicester 76 today is on display in our exhibition hall. The exhibition displays have changed since this, but it's a static exhibit. To run again in service, it will need quite a bit of work. I think a new steel underframe. The restoration was absolutely remarkable, but it will need to be done again properly in our workshop to be fit for many years service. Hopefully one day we better ride on the Leicester tram again. But if not, there are other trams at Christ which will give you the same sort of experience. So apart from visiting Christ, another place you can go to is the old tram depot at Stoneygate. Nobody ever took a photograph of this depot when it had trams because it ceased to be used for trams in 1922. No photographs exist. But someone was Mr. Michael, I can't see his name, Cockcroft, is it? Yeah, well, Cockcroft is wonderful painting of what it might have looked like in the winter. But the Leicester Transport Heritage Trust are at the depot, and sometimes at their open days, and they're lovely displays of trams and buses and artifacts from Leicester's transport history, and usually it rides on some vintage bus as well. So somewhere else to visit when the pandemic is over is an open day at the Stoneygate tram depot. Another place to visit, of course, is Abbey pumping station, where there's a lovely model of a Leicester tram built by Mark Pearson, who was the expert on Leicester tramways. There's also a small display as well. Somewhere else to visit. We've got to the end. Right, can I plug some books in now? Right, if I can come back on screen, we've actually got to the end. Can I make a plug for this book? This is an excellent book on Leicester's trams and buses, written by Andrew Bartlett. I really recommend it. It's absolutely, it puts the trams in the context because they don't exist in isolation. Trams are part of the overall public transport scene, and buses and trams working together. So I recommend this book. It's very recently published. It's an excellent read. If you want to know a bit more about the history, I recommend that. All out of print, but the classic work on this was Mark Pearson's book, Leicester's Trams in Retrospect. And you may better get those on eBay, or maybe to pick one up second hand. So if you want to find out a bit more, there's some books you can find. Visit Christ, visit the Stoneygate tram depot when they have some open days again. Visit the pumping station and see the model there. Two other books you may find on eBay or secondhand are two books by Jeff Crease, Leicester's Trams, a wonderful photographic album. Another book called Leicester and its Trams, also by Jeff Crease, another authority on the tramway system. Sadly, Jeff Crease is no longer with us, but I do recommend those books. You may find them secondhand or on eBay. And of course, the Leicester Transport Heritage Trust are continuing to publish books on Leicester's transport history, including the trams. Here's one here, Operation Scrap Iron, which tells the story of the final demise of the Leicester tramway system. More recently, they produced a book on the Stoneygate tram depot. The Heritage Group have a lease on this, and this is where from time to time there are open days and exhibitions and trips on old buses. So do look out for books published by the Leicester Transport Heritage Trust. It's an ongoing project to, relate the story of Leicester's transport systems. And it does put the trams in the context of buses, the overall picture. So plenty of extra information if you want to know a bit more. By all means, though, visit Cryche, visit the depot, and visit the pumping station. Right? Enjoy your journey into the past. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it. I've had to rush it a bit at the end. Sorry for that, but I think we've got there.
Thank you very much, John. That was brilliant. Excellent.
There's a comment here that's saying that car 76 was actually a cricket pavilion in East Yorkshire.
It was a cricket pavilion, but it ended up on the farm at Snaith. Well, that's typical of the sort of uses that trams are put to. You could buy one, cricket pavilions, and changing rooms at sports grounds. If you could buy a tram for £5, you've got a cheap shed or a cheap building. Many of them ended up on allotments. And Cryche has, in fact, a lot of the trams at Cryche have been found in locations like that. I think Chesterfield number 7 was somebody lived in it for years. It's amazing, really, how they've survived.
And Cryche Tramway Village is actually open again, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's
right.
It is, yes. Obviously, they're having to conform with all the regulations for the, social distancing. But you can visit it. It's open weekends and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.